Today's agenda, we have two. Oh, yeah. Thank you. We're recording the meeting, so don't say anything you don't want on camera. So today we're going to discuss two items for the CSSC version 4. The first one will be Jim Warren will present the proposal on adding a new order called the Leptosols to the Canadian System of Soil Classification. And then the second item we're going to discuss is the updating of artwork and diagrams and photos in the CSSC, and Lewis will talk to us a little bit about that, and we can have a discussion about the direction we'd like to go for the fourth edition of our manual. So without further ado, Jim, if you want to steal the show and set up your presentation.
Okay, can everybody see that? Not yet, maybe? How about that?
Yes.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So we'd like to, we're proposing the, well, a few things. First, this slide deck is one I presented at the Edmonton CSSC conference about a year ago. So it's just a rehash of that one. For those of you who may have forgotten or maybe not read the paper. This is a list of my colleagues, Dan, of course, Richard Heck, and Louis Pierre Como out of Fredericton. Okay, so we're proposing a new order, the leptosolic order for the new system. And there's several reasons for that, but shallow soils then are very common throughout the world, and these are soils that have bedrock or some type of a solid contact, usually typically within a meter of surface. Okay, they're recognized at the highest level at the world reference base as leptosols, and they're basically anything with characterized as having a lithic contact close to the surface, and they occur almost anywhere in Canada. We actually have quite a bit of them. So soil materials less than 10 centimeters in thickness are currently considered non-soil by definition in the third edition of the Canadian System Soil Classification, but they are recognized as substrates in ecological classification. So as well as being shallow soils, we're actually proposing including soils that are currently considered non-soils in our system. So these soils, they're quite extensive actually. They're usually contain a lot of either grasslands or low bushes, but they're primarily not agricultural in use. They're usually forested or grasslands, that sort of thing. But if you look at the area, they basically span from the Yukon over to Newfoundland and Labrador, covering an estimated 562 million hectares, or almost 60% of Canada's land area. So if you take that into consideration, then if we do accept that we're going to have leptosols in an order, it would be probably the most extensive soil order in the country. Just as an aside or an extra, lithic subgroups were actually previously recognized back in the version Canadian system in 1964, but they were discontinued, 74. But they were discontinued in 1978 for the first edition of the Canadian System Soil Classification. Currently, shallow soils are actually handled within the system, but at the family level. But as probably most of you know, the family level in our classification system is pretty much ignored. And what happens is that most shallow soils are actually only mapped as a phase of a non-lithic series. So in terms of how they're handled from the mineral family, it's based on depth. So non-soil, of course, is less than 10 centimeters thick without basically increasing in depth, so on down. I won't belabor the actual names, but these are the family level names up to a meter in depth. Similarly, when you get to the organic soils, sort of similar idea, except the control section is usually up to 1.6 meters or 160 centimeters. And there's similar depth controls there under the family system. That's currently how they are technically handled. As I said, most of them are just mapped as lithic or shallow phases of a non-shallow soil. So our proposed order then, so for a leptosol, is any mineral soil less than 25 centimeters in thickness above a leptic contact. And we'll get into how a leptic contact is different from a lithic contact in a minute, or any organic soil material less than 60 centimeters or 40 centimeters, depending on the amount of degradation of the material, and again, above a leptic contact. So this includes by removing the minimum depth criteria. So it would be the current definition is as I've got it written there. The only difference would be we actually take out the arbitrary less than 10 centimeters thick as part of the definition. So that would come out, and we'll see how that fits in a little later. So a leptic contact then is we're proposing using leptic as a qualifying term, primarily because leptic is used by the world reference base, to be added at the subgroup level to any soil in the soil key to indicate the presence of a leptic contact within 25 to a meter depth below in mineral soils, and 60 or 40 or 60 centimeters for organic materials. Okay, so the crutch of this is then what's a leptic contact, or what are we defining as a leptic contact? So a leptic contact then would include not only a lithic contact or bedrock contact, it would also include paralithic materials and fragmental materials, and where the lithic contact or the bedrock contact, you wouldn't describe the profile any further than that bedrock contact. However, with the paralithic and fragmental contacts, those then are actually included as part of your description. So a lithic contact then is any R layer or bedrock layer essentially with overlying unconsolidated material. And the R layer is material that you can't break with your hands and has a Mohs scale of hardness of greater than 3, and you can't dig it with a spade. In other words, it's hard bedrock. Paralithic contact then is just sort of the rest of it. In other words, it is material or rock material. It could be broken or whatever, but it's soft rock material, has a hardness of less than or equal to 3 on Mohs scale. You can break it with your hands typically, and you can dig it with a spade. So you can include that as part of your profile description. And then of course, a fragmental contact then is fragmental material. So gravel, cobbles, stones, boulders, etc., constituting greater than 90% of coarse materials by volume. So these 3 sort of definitions then would be included as part of our definitions, and these would all be considered as part of a leptic contact within the definition of the leptosolic soils. So we've got 2 great groups within the leptosols. Okay, so this is sort of the proposed key. So there's the leptic leptosols, and then there is just the leptosols, which are essentially greater than 25 centimeters. So the leptic leptosols essentially cover anything that is less than 10 centimeters in thickness, which is now considered non-soil. So we'd have a folic, which is a folic leptic leptosol, which would be leptic leptosols with organic materials that are composed of upland materials. Then there would be a histic leptic leptosols, which essentially is all other organic materials, not differentiating based on the amount of decomposition. And then there's the glycolic, basically following, for the most part, the current key in the Canadian system. So the big glycolic leptic leptosols, a glide saline, okay, and we're calling it saline because essentially within a 10 centimeter depth of material over top of a leptic contact, we wouldn't expect to see a solenitic B develop, but you should be able to measure conductivity greater than 4. So that would be a saline or glide saline leptic leptosols. And then the remaining group there, I won't go into the details of it, but essentially it follows the Brunissolic order, depending on the pH of the material, etc., that's below. So, okay, so the leptosolic order would be the leptosolic mineral soils less than 25 centimeters in thickness with elliptic contact, or organic, again, less than 60, depending on the type of organic composition or the decomposition of the organic material, or less than 40 in terms of a fibrate material. So there would be a folic leptosol, okay, a fibric, mesic, and humic leptosol. So those would cover all the organic versions. And then again, following more or less the Canadian, the key in the Canadian system, current system. So it'd be a glide leptosol, glide vertic, vertic, glide podzolic, podzolic, glide saline. Again, not concerned about the abundance or the development of a solenitic B horizon. Excuse me. And glide chernosem, glide luvic for the luvisols with a B, and then the glide glide and non-glide brunisolic versions in the soil. So these would be essentially following that order. Okay, so the sort of a summary of the proposed changes, then we would integrate into all the mineral soils having a lithic contact greater than or equal to 25, less than 100 centimeters depth. Excuse me. Leptic qualifying term would be added to the subgroup level of the key to indicate the presence of a leptic contact occurring greater than 25 and less than 100 for mineral soils, and of course within 160 centimeters for organic materials. Use of the qualifying term, we're actually proposing using a qualifying term so that you don't actually, we're not necessitating the doubling of the length of the soil key. So essentially, instead of defining each of the leptic versions of each of the non-leptic soils, we just say, okay, well, if there's a leptic contact within the profile, then we would just add the leptic term to whatever current subgroup that would be. That's the only real difference there. Lastly, would have to change the, instead of a leptic class, instead of a lithic class, which is currently what it is, it would have to be changed to a leptic class. And we would actually add the exceedingly shallow leptic family class to it for any soil that's greater, less than 10 centimeters in thickness. Essentially, everything else stays pretty much the same. So our recommendations then is that the leptosolic order should be adopted as part of the Canadian system. And the minimum depth criteria of 10 centimeters should be removed from the formal definition of soil and for all other related definitions in the Canadian system for consistency. And minor changes to depth criteria for lithology or lepthology classes for the family level should be adopted for consistency with the world reference base and as part of the leptosolic order of the Canadian system. Some late breaking examples here sent to us by Paul Sanborn. This is a project they did in Calvert Island, for example, and this is the topography and the landscape that you see pretty much as a leptosolic topography. And these are some of the profiles, and we actually, Daniel very kindly classified them out based on our current key. So each of these soils that Paul sent us the pictures for, these are how they would classify out. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the for my little talk here. So if you have questions.
Yes, Dan, Dr. Dan Pennick, please.
Jim, I think this is a great idea, and thanks to you and your colleagues for bringing it forward. And it's long overdue, so it's I think it's a great idea. I just had a question. I zoned out for a minute there, and I missed a little bit about your explanation of leptic as a qualifying term. So could you just take me through that again?
Sure, that's a bit of a shall we say a little bit out of scope.
Yeah.
okay, currently the system, the key for the Canadian system, of course, has, for example, currently has glide terms for pretty much every subgroup in the key. And what we're suggesting is, like, we'd have to do the same thing if we wanted to follow that system. It would be the same thing for the elliptic version. So they have to have a definition for each one. Now, back in the 1974 version of the Canadian system, they actually have what are called qualifying terms for, it was lithic at the time, but essentially essentially you would add the elliptic term to, so if you've got a soil that is a bruttisolic gray brown luvasol falling out, using something that I'm fairly familiar with. So if you had a leptic contact within the profile, that then would just be a leptic bruttisolic gray brown luvasol, and you could apply that to pretty much any one of the subgroup terms within the current key.
I've got the example.
Yeah.
I've got the example
again,
up on the screen there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's great. I mean, I think that's a really good idea. But one of the other things you did was sort of sneak in for the first time ever a saline subgroup into the Canadian system of soil classification.
Yeah,
And
that's just for the leptosols itself, though, not for any other order.
I know, but you've still brought it into the system, right? I mean, so why wouldn't we have a saline subgroup for the Chernozems where they are, anyways, my point is, if we're going to bring in a lithic qualifier or a modifying term, I would really suggest we bring in a saline modifying term as well. And because it's a tremendous gap in the Canadian system, which, as it turned out, was no one's particular interest, so it wasn't brought forward in this revision. But to me, that would be I think the modifying subgroup idea is a really good, or a modifier is a really good idea. But for both saline and carbonated, it would also be a very good idea to bring that in. So I would certainly support it. I would just support broadening it so it includes some other elements which are currently unrecognized at the subgroup level in the Canadian system. I really agree with you, Jim. You don't want to bring in a leptic version of every subgroup, because it just becomes, we've already done that too much in the system, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's unwilling. In fact, I actually put in our minor modifications in the forum, I actually put in a suggestion that we remove the glide version, or the glide term as well. So it could be a modifier.
Yes. I think that's a very good idea, Jim. But I say I would certainly support bringing in saline and carbonated as well, because in the prairies, they're very, very common and they are currently unrecognized. And yet, I would say salinity is probably the #1 thing a farmer wants to know about, right?
That's true. We're the only reason we chose for the couple of minor ones there for saline as opposed to a solonetzik. We could have quite easily have used solonetzik. The point being, at a 10 centimeters of soil, with 10 centimeters of soil, you're not going to be able to. We doubt you're going to.
Jim, you became muted there.
I noticed I got muted.
There you go.
Okay, so in 10 centimeters, in the 10 centimeter depth, we don't expect to see the development of a BNT or a BN horizon. So therefore we just said, okay, well, simplicity, keep it simple. Just call it saline.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
I just wanted to add or ask the question before we move on to Tony's question. Does anybody remember the transition from the 74 to the 78 version? And does anybody have any recollection? I know that might be dating yourselves or aging yourselves, but the transition where we went away from these modifying subgroups that you could apply, where we didn't really fully define these subgroups, they were just basically a modification of one of the other subgroups. Does anybody recall the transition or any justification for that transition? There's nothing in the National Soil Survey Committee meeting documents that explains the rationale for the decision to go away from this. And so I just thought I would put the question out there, but I suspect that nobody probably remembers this either. So
We could ask Darwin, he would remember probably, but
I think it might be before Darwin's time even, but Jerry Cohen and Wayne Pettipus might have ideas because I think they were on the discussion committee back at
Yeah,
the.
actually, Wayne was, but Jerry wasn't. I don't
Okay,
think Jerry came in until after 1980. So anyway, but yes, we're actually thinking about reaching out to Jerry and Wayne, see if they knew anything.
or was the lab college tied up with that stuff too?
He wasn't mentioned as the part of the subgroup in the 1978 version. So
Tony, please.
yes.
Yeah, it was an interesting proposal. I do have some questions, I guess. You referenced other classification systems that use leptosols, and I was looking through and I only saw really the World Resource Base, and ISRIC has it, and they define their leptosols down to 75 centimeters. I was wondering why you came back to 25, because it seems very shallow. And in that light, I think you could reduce the number of subgroups that you have within each of these great groups right now, as you presently have. It's very unlikely that you would have a vertic leptosol. You just don't have the soil mass to be able to force slicken sides within that clay within 25 centimeters of the surface. So I really don't think those would occur, for example. And similarly, I think we could get away from having the big terms brunisolic and a chernozemic, because you're implying a lot of the other order criteria on those soils. So for example, why don't we just leave it as Utrecht and district, and that's capturing the issue about pH that you want to. I think that's really the purpose. I don't think you should be calling them a chernozemic, because I don't think it matches the chernozemic horizon criteria. They're often melanic, if you wanted to be really picky. So I think we've got to watch some of the terminology here in terms of the naming those subgroups, and it would and sort of streamline the process. One other final thing, I think with fragmental, I'm not sure wherever you would get into, if you start recognizing gravels and those, going to get into sort of the problem with particle size discontinuities. We could have, are you referring to fluvial gravels over bedrock? These are kind of issues that would be very difficult to recognize in the field. I mean, I've seen paralithic conglomerate, and even in that situation, you don't have pure gravel. You often have fragments of conglomerate rocks would contain round particles, round rocks, but they're all cemented together in little bigger chunks. So I think you want to be careful with our definition of what we include within the fragmental definition. I'll stop there.
Yeah, we've seen out in Peterborough County, where we're doing quite a bit of mapping recently. We're seeing a lot of fragmental stuff within the control section. Normally, those end up being, most of them being brunissols or whatever mapped as brunissols currently. But we do see quite a few of them there.
How deep are you looking though?
There's a meter.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with this 25 centimeter depth, which I think we want to recognize, but I'm not sure that we're getting all of these activities occurring within that 10 inches. 10 inches.
Yeah, to be honest with you, Tony, we grappled with that for a while, and to tell you the honest truth, why we settled on 25 centimeters, I don't honestly remember. So we went back and forth a number of times, but we settled on 25 centimeters. Dan or Richard, do you recall why we settled on 25?
I do.
Yeah.
I know we played with, I think we played with 75, 50 and 25, and I think we settled on 25, but I don't recall why exactly.
It
Go
may have
ahead,
just,
Jimmy.
You
I think it
know,
was,
It would almost sound like you're just thinking of the old plow layer, as a
Yeah.
depth.
yeah, I think it more or less had to do with, had it there.
I think Louis has the answer for us.
Yes, it's
see-
based on the last version of the WRB soil classification for the leptosol. If I can share my screen here, you cannot share screen. Can I share? Can you let me share screen, Daniel?
Yeah, go for it. I didn't even realize I was still sharing.
Okay. So in the last version of the WRB, the international classification, can you see my screen now?
mhm.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, here it's the 25 centimeters, and 75 centimeter deep is only when you have very few fine soil, only less than 20% of the fine soil in 75 centimeter deep. So to align with the international classification, we decide to go for 25 centimeter.
Thank you, Luke here. So Tony, there, I think there's your answer there.
Okay, no, I was fine. I was just curious because I was looking through, and I mean, in soil taxonomy, they are still just recognizing lithic subgroups, and they're not recognizing leptosols, I don't think, are they?
They've got technosols and lithosols, I think, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
but
Yeah, no, they don't recognize shallow soils yet in the US, but maybe
well,
if they had the Canadian Shield, they would.
no, I guess what I'm thinking is, you know, we're
Yeah.
changing, we're changing into using modifying subgroups, and we're happy to put in saline, possibly glide, and we're changing lithic to leptic. That's fair enough. I'm just wondering, where do we draw the line in some of these other ones, you know?
Yeah, no, that's fair, Tony. And then but just to recap, just because I'm taking notes, then Tony, the main concern you have is just the first of all the number of subgroups that appear under the leptic leptosols, in consideration that there's only maximum 10 centimeters of soil, and so really what soil forming processes will you actually ever be able to observe within a material that's only 10 centimeters thick? And even even for the leptic leptos, or even for the leptosols, where you only have 25 centimeters, there's some considerations about what could possibly happen within 25 centimeters of soil.
Right, and I mean,
Okay.
and I think we want to be careful in terms of using existing soil order names. You know, let's think of, for the Luvic, for example, Luvisols, why don't we use Luvic as we have done in the Glycol? And then we're separating it from being a Luvisolic order soil, where we're expecting to have an AE and a BT in combination. Because you're not going to get that within 10 inches or 25 centimeters.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes, yeah, okay, I understand that too. So usually order names introduces some level of confusion in there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking we want to be, and it's the same with a lot of these other ones. Soon as, are we really going to get glide or saline soils on top? Is it sort of an overflow situation? Because most of our saline soils are groundwater generated, so we're not necessarily going to get
That was probably me.
25
That was
centimeters.
yeah, that was probably me, Tony, because I remember doing survey in southeastern Alberta and having saline paralithic soils that were very thin over the paralithic bedrock, and the soils were saline as a result of the salinity in the bedrock. And so that was probably that you can blame that one on me.
No, I'm not blaming anybody. I just had a questioning, I guess, is all I'm asking, you know, sort of.
Yeah,
And I you know, to go through those again, I think we could pare it down
sure.
and be a bit more concise. And just,
Okay.
sorry, I've seen for these modifying subgroups, we seem to be tending towards using saline, possibly leptic. We're going to use glide possibly. So we would be modifying the book, well, the other subgroup definitions of pretty drastically.
Yeah, Tony. So I think that I think this. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean it's a bit of a segue into I think a larger discussion around these use of these modifying subgroups as opposed to individually defined subgroups, and I think that we're going to tackle that approach, I think, in an upcoming session. Like no, that, and I understand, yeah, because this is something that's been alluded to a couple of times in our meetings so far. Like, what if we did this? But we haven't really addressed it head on, and so that is one of the things I think that we'll address probably, I think, at the June meeting, where we'll talk about, okay, what are the impacts if we did decide to go back to a kind of a 1974 version where we have these things that were called modifying subgroups. And so you defined all the main subgroups, and then things like glade, carbonated, saline, lithic became modifying subgroups. And then you just have a definition for what that modifying subgroup is. And it's consistent across the orders, right? And so, but it does that's a very big change. And so it's something that we have to, I think we'll have to discuss and deal with head on as an individual topic. And that, I think, will affect what happens with the proposal for the leptosols, with how we proceed with adding the leptosols into the system, whether we decide we'll go with these modifying subgroups or not. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a larger discussion than just saying, hey, by the way, we're gonna do this.
Yeah, because I mean, presently these modifying subgroups are what we use as phases right now. We have a saline phase, we have lithic phases, and all of those. And really, we're proposing that it would go into a modifying term.
Except for the glade. So the glade, for some reason, got elevated. It got elevated to subgroups, and all the others got dropped to phases. So yeah, that's another interesting point.
But that's primarily because we had a glycol, so we had to have some compromise from a glycol to a glide soil.
Chi, please.
Hi. Yeah, Jim, thank you. I think introducing this to the Canadian statistical classification would help describe a lot of soils in the mountain areas, especially for some of the forest soils and some kind of colder climate type of conditions. And yeah, I definitely welcome that. My concern share a lot of the concern that Tony has raised. You know, we got a lot of the subgroups there, and some of those modifier there itself has a thickness kind of requirement there. So you know, we probably need to think about that. Whatever there, if it's not feasible, then maybe remove them, because there's quite a bit of subgroup you have listed there. Another thing is, you know, these are considered more or less from a system approach, or you have to have this kind of modifier here or there. You know, you might want to give a reality check in the field for soil with this shallow depth. What are most likely to come? What are most likely the ones we will see in the field? Therefore, you know, modify the subgroup to a level that address the most common situations. You know, there is a systematic thing. There is always a need of reality check. So that's my comment.
Yeah, we put most of the subgroups in more or less to cover all the bases. And I think Tony made a good point. He's, you know, most of the vertic soils, if not all the vertisolic soils, for example, you're going to see in the West. And I guess Tony be more or less the leading expert, I guess, on vertisols in the country. But again, you know, we don't see too many vertisols, for example, in Ontario, if any. But based on, I guess, on the his understanding, I think, so we could remove quite easily, I guess, remove the vertisolic subgroup out, because he doesn't think that would actually occur. And I have to sort of lean to his expertise. Anyway, my point is that we tried to cover all of the bases based on what we had seen in the field and what we thought we might see in the field. So that was sort of our, we're not saying this is the be all and end all, but it's at least a starting point for discussion. And I think that's, we've achieved that goal, if nothing else.
Yeah, like I really think that we can revisit probably the list of subgroups based on the feedback. I think that that's a realistic thing. And we do have some things in there, like we have the Brunissolic versions of things, and then just Utric and Distric. And that was just on the assumption that, you know, in the Brunissolic versions of these things, we would actually see a BM, whereas in the other ones, we wouldn't necessarily see a BM. It would just be parent material. And I guess the question becomes, is it really that critical if you have 5 centimeters of BM or 5 centimeters of CK in these soils? Probably doesn't really make a difference. The pH is probably good enough to help us separate these things out. So I think that the point's taken. I think that, you know, we can rehash and think about these things, you know, in terms of, you know, what we would probably see to reduce the list. Like any introduction of any other soil orders, I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of this will be okay. Take this and then start applying it to soils that we see. And then we'll have a better idea of whether or not it's going to work or not work for us. And so hopefully you can lean on people to provide examples of soil profiles as well, and we can start applying these keys to see how often do we see these different things. Richard?
Thanks. Tony, you brought up an interesting scenario. I mean, on one hand, your comment about can we realistically imagine or expect to encounter, for example, verdict over top within 25 centimeters developing, or I don't know what the experience would be in terms of the possibility of encountering a Chernozemic A. What for definitions overlying a bedrock. So that though, and Jim has already touched on that this is not the definitive thing, that we have to be realistic about what would potentially be a great group or subgroups that we would consider listing. But I think my question, my comment I wanted, sorry, my broader comment here is in how we're using the terminologies, and the one that I reflect upon is glade versus glycolic, because we're using Chernozemic or podzolic or brunissolic. I think in terms of the glade glycolic, we would be applying, and the vertisols are a perfect example of this. We have the possibility of applying the glycolic in the vertisols because they're expressing the diagnostic feature of the glycols, the prominent modeling or the intense drab coloration, you know, but it's being keyed out above the glycols. So that's why we're throwing the glycolic in, because there's also the possibility of having the glade vertisols, which are just not expressing. If it wasn't a vertisol, they still wouldn't make it in a glycol because they don't mean. So the glycolic versus the glade, and we see luvisolic. Are we consistent? This is a question I'm throwing out. Are we consistent throughout our system in applying these adjectives, either using the full glycolic or glade or luvisolic or luvic, or some shortened terms when it's following after or it's representing a weak expression, or if it's a feature that's present, it's referring to a feature that's present in the profile. And if it wasn't for the soil having been keyed out above that soil order, we'd be calling it that soil order. I hope I'm not convoluting this excessively. That's my one comment. I've got another one that I want to bring up after.
I could see your point, Richard, and I know when we were going with the vertisols, and primarily did we see prominent models. I mean, the material is already a dull color anyway, so it was very difficult to say it.
Yeah.
But what we were sort of interpreting was whether we had some oxidation and evidence that we had that contrast. So those were there. The other thing that we keep in mind is that the primary reason that vertisols are confined to the prairies is because we have smectitic clays. We do not have the clays in the St. Lawrence Basin don't have the smectite content that we have to have the shrink swell and the turbation. So that's really the reason why we don't have a true vertisol in the eastern part of Canada.
Yeah, pretty much east of the Manitoba Ontario border.
Yeah, we need those feldspars.
My point was going more to the use of these adjective terms.
Yeah,
Whether it's
and
important for
again, I think
version versus rather than chernozemic, this type of notion of luvasolic, lubic.
well, yeah. I mean, I go back to the glycol situation where we have a humic top, not a chernozemic top.
Right.
For the mineral layer, which is organic rich. And I'm just thinking that with some of these scenarios in the, well, like the picture that Paul gave Jim for those mountain situations, to have an idea that we've got a humic top that's possibly 10 centimeters, whether it's meets the criteria for a chernozem or for a melanic brunisol, it doesn't really matter. We have some organic rich mineral layer at the surface, which qualifies to make it a humic leptosol.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm assuming that humic leptosol would still have AH, BM, and rock within the 25 centimeters. I don't know.
Yes, I think so. Tony, just a question. Okay, so let's say you had doesn't matter, lithic contact at 20 centimeters. Okay, so you've got a leptosol, okay, and it's got a chernozemic AH. Is your argument that you wouldn't get a chernozemic AH on top of that, or it doesn't matter that we have one or not?
I don't think it matters. First, whether we're going to get down to the fact that it meets all the criteria for a chernozem. I'm just a simplification, because I mean, it's the variability that you get within a meter head-on is going to be going above. You probably go from 5 centimeters to 12 centimeters, all within that meter. And slowly your depth to bedrock could vary from 15 to 0 to 25 or 30. Now, do you suddenly start worrying about, oh, this is no longer a leptosol, it's a leptic whatever brunisol. I mean, you have to make a judgment call, but I'm just thinking that in terms of assuming that most of these scenarios will be in the mountainous terrain, I don't know if we want to get into.
Ours aren't mountain, it's up in pretty much a lot of it's in northern
Boreal.
Ontario, but
You're in the
yeah,
boreal.
it's boreal, yeah.
So it's unlikely you're going to have chernozems. That's all. That was all. And I mean, even on our situations in southern Alberta, we were up on the Porcupine Hills and we were often dealing with the same situation. Are they lithic chernozems, or were we going to put brunisols in there? And we ended up, going with the chernozems because most of this area around it is chernozem.
Okay.
But they were lithic. But I don't think if we want to, that was just a suggestion, because as soon as I see a chernozem, I'm thinking thick grassland soils. I mean,
Yeah.
And if you're going to get that way, then are you going to recognize this is a brown chernozemic leptosol, dark brown, to capture all the ecological characteristics as well, associated with short grass, long grass?
Yeah, I like your suggestion, Tony. The humic instead of the chernozemic. That makes sense, and then especially when you put it like you just put it in context with the glacials, right? Like it's not like we have different glacials in Manitoba than we do in Ontario. You know, both of them can have AH and then a BG horizon, but it's not like the ones in the prairies are called, you know, Chernozemic glacialic soils, right? They're just humic glacials. So
Yeah. That's
an
a
interesting point.
fair point.
Yep,
Yeah.
you have to be careful because we do have a humic up above that's dealing with pure organic deposit.
We do, Richard, but that's already convoluted, I think, in our system, and the fact that we have them for humic glacials already, right? And so,
That's
yes.
true too.
yeah, it's a nice little mess. Louis Pierre.
To continue about Chernozemic leptosol or humic leptosol, I missed the first few minutes of that presentation, but it might depend on which groups go first in the classification and where we put leptosol order in the classification. If it's at the very beginning or at the very end, then that would affect if we have Chernozemic leptosol, yes or no, if it's meaningful, yes or no.
And I think what the proposal says that the leptosols would be up at the front, no?
Yep, up at the front.
Before anthroposols?
Well, that's
That's-
remains,
No,
that
I'm
remains.
just-
You're doing how he's doing on purpose now.
Sorry. I'm fighting by that one.
Well, Tony, if we can get our leptosols through before Anne gets her anthroposols
Yeah,
through,
yeah.
then it's her problem, not ours.
No, I'm.
Oh, good stuff. Is there more questions? Rong Wei?
Hi. I just want to add the question Tony brought up earlier. And further, leptic contact, it's perfect to have lytic and paralytic one. But for the fragmental, that is, we should be carefully use that. Because that is could be confused with fluval material, what we have in some areas in the Manitoba, for example, is because some of the fluval material we cannot defer or different that from the lytic contact or the fluval materials. For example, on the top of that fragment of the material only about maybe 8 centimeters or 9 centimeters or 10 centimeters, very, very black soil profile. But on the underneath is a pure or gravels or stone like that. If we use that as a elliptic contact, we may clarify that as a ellipsol, and then we may change our definition for the fluvial materials. So that make me confused sometimes.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So-
that's my
so-
question. Yeah.
Wrong Wei, so that example profile that you just mentioned, so 10 or so centimeters of nice black soil over top of a fairly clean gravel. How would you be classifying that right now?
We clarify that the gravel, fluvial material still under the Chernozem.
Yeah, Chernozem.
Yeah.
So you consider that to be fluvial material, even though it's
Yes.
fragmental.
Yes,
Well, it would still be fluvial, but
yes.
Or humic or Regasol.
Yeah, that depends. Yeah, that depends if there's a B horizon or no B horizon. Sometimes, even the very, very just right after the top 8 or 10 centimeters, there's a little bit on the B horizon. We may do not classify that as a Regasol, but most of them we classify them as a Regasol, developed or derived from the fluval material.
right. But it should depend on whether or not that A horizon, the surface is Chernozemic A or not, right? The B horizon doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It's just a Rego Chernozem.
So we go Chernozem or a humic Regasol.
Interesting. So that's the fragmental. Myself, I'd have to go back and revisit why we decided to group the fragmental in with the paralithic and lithic. I believe it was also based on the way that the WRB was grouping things. But I think theirs was theirs is a bit looser. Theirs is up to 20% fines, I believe, if from that document that was shared earlier. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, Richard, do you have any other question? Are there any other questions for Jim or anyone else? Okay, so I think then what I've heard then and what our group will take back from this is that we'll do a little bit more thinking about the number of the subgroups that are appearing under the great group in terms of, well, what we've discussed here. What do you think you would expect to see within, only 10 centimeters of soil, and then within 25 centimeters of soil, and maybe reduce the number of subgroups, and then bring that back for a second look by the working group. And then a revisit of this concept of including or not including the fragmental materials as part of a leptic definition. So we'll have to think on these things a little bit. So can we then we'll close the discussion on the leptosols. Does that work? And we'll move on to the next item, which is artwork. I don't think there'll be too much discussion about the need for new artwork. But oh, did Lewis disappear? Oh, there you are, Lewis. So Lewis has agreed to work on artwork for the 4th edition. I had asked Lewis if he would be able to give us maybe a few examples of some ideas he has for some diagrams. So I thought we could start there, and then I would welcome comments from anyone that's on the call with regards to what they think might be some necessary improvements to either diagrams or photos of soil profiles or landscapes. I think that it would be nice to do an overhaul of most of the figures and pictures that are in the book, with some more modern ones. But so maybe Lewis, if you wanted to share your screen.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Can everyone see that pretty good?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, yeah, so I'll just walk you through. I sent a few images of some of the updated diagrams to Dan, and then we discussed whether or not I should keep on doing more. We thought it'd be good to just hold back until we get some feedback, and then also see, because there will be tons of updates, I'm sure, especially with the soil profiles moving forward. So didn't want to go too far without getting everyone's approval and that sort of thing. So what I've done here is just shown a few of the sort of before images, and then what I've done with some of the after images. But this first slide is just talking about adding color to the soil horizon diagrams. So my plan is to keep track of everything on this sheet here, or maybe put it into an Excel just so I have all of the colors really easily findable, so we can update them as we go along. And then trying to sort of coordinate what the colors mean to the suffix, or what the suffix means to the color. Okay, so here's the first image that we have. This is showing the mixing of horizons. So I just updated it to have some more color, and had to modify it a little bit so that so the colors would stay in the line. But yeah, that's what that one looks like. Yeah, so here's some of the profile descriptions, and just an update with some color and making sure that everything lines up perfectly. And then a similar one for these some of these salt affected soils here. And yeah, here's another one, just of one of the more technical diagrams. I just modified it so that all of the words are now visible, because I feel like they weren't quite exactly on the last one. And then this last one is for the structure. Just editing a little bit just to make sure that all the words are more visible. But yeah, there's other things we could do with this too. We could instead of having all of the measurements there, we could put it all on a scale and have the scale at the bottom to make it a little bit cleaner. But yeah, that's where it comes into everybody else. Some ideas for new graphics or maybe some modifications if anyone's had any chance to look through and see what they want to update. I wasn't sure. I added some ideas that Dan and I had talked about that we hadn't really gone through, but I thought this would be a good spot just to see if anybody else had some ideas first before we move ahead. Yeah, I guess
Constantine, go for it.
Okay.
Just a question. So if we imply colors, that would mean black and white printing of the manual would be questionable, and many people would like to print it black and white. And so we may have to make sure that when it is printed black and white, the differentiation is still visible. So the purple doesn't blend with brown, being the same shade. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, that's a good point too for, yeah, like red, blue, or red, green colorblind people too, or just trying to make sure that there's different shades. But yeah, we have, there's a bunch of like apps that I've seen to help with that.
Chi.
I like color in many ways, and yeah, I think we probably need to consider if printing is going to be a factor. You know, these days software have advanced so much, and color should be either add to that. But I do have comment on two of the color you use there, like the BNT, that pink stuff.
Oh yeah, I imagine there's going to be lots of discussion about colors.
That should be way lighter for soils. We don't see pink stuff that much.
Oh yeah,
So
that's definitely not what I'm putting forward. I'm just saying, like, I don't think the horizons would look like that. I'm just saying, like, yeah, it's just a color to differentiate the end.
Sure. Anything with AE related stuff, they should be lighter. You know, like AE is a light green, and if AEJ suddenly go to a dark, like a black, that's not good. I think just AE, AEJ, AEGJ, these all have the same color, because often AE itself means lighter color. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
And another is the organic, you know, like the organic soil there, the diagnostic kind of tiers versus the middle soil. That green color will not work for organic soils because most of these are dead sands, and they are brownish to dark brown to black. So
yeah, maybe what I'll do then first is like go throughout the whole textbook so far and all the horizon descriptions and try to come up with colors that will work and that are still printable and in grayscale.
I think,
and then go from there.
Yeah, I think your major tone of color to play with these things is probably gray, the gray system, the gray series of colors, and the brown series of colors. And you know, occasionally maybe a little bit orange kind of features related to some of the podotic soils and boracic soils. And other color tone, I don't see them fit well here with the soil materials.
Yeah, I think one strategy, Lewis, might be to go into some of the more substantial databases that exist for soils around the world, or even the Kansas database, and look at colors for specific horizons that we're seeing. You can pull those out. We can convert the 10YR color scale over to RGB or something like that, and we can at least use that as a starting point to get the kind of the tones that we want, and then we can play with things like saturation and brightness and those kind of things to fine tune so that we can differentiate them a little bit better. But yeah, I agree that we want to make sure that we stick with colors that are more closely what we would see in the country. And so that basically limits you to the 10YR page, because that's the only page everyone ever uses. So
Well, 10YR,
yeah.
yeah, 10YR 2.5Y, you know, this kind of range
Mhm.
is very common. And blue occasionally for some glass soils, but overall, avoid those very bright colors, because soil material in general, they're not very bright color kind of thing, except for a few features. Yeah, I'm willing to participate a bit more if that's required.
Sure, yeah. I was just
sounds
putting in
good.
cool colors to sort of help differentiate. But if everyone's more on the page of like, let's keep it to exactly what soil looks like, then that's totally fine too.
Constantine, did you have another question, or is your hand just still up?
Yeah, oh no, I have suggestion. I would object going to the natural colors and making colors as perfectly matching as possible, because first of all, there is variety of soils, and you can't match that. Second, if you start differentiating brown from dark brown and so on, you would make it perfect looking, but printing would be impossible unless you have a very good printer. So all horizons would blind together. So I would really make very caution decisions about differentiation of colors. Some, yes, probably for better than black and white we have now, but don't go far. Don't make it perfect and natural. In that sense, green for organic is just fine, because it is not mimicking exact color of the soil. It's just a symbol of all horizons. Symbol of, it could be like brown, black, pale brown, and green. Something simple, and yet visible on black and white printing. And also I would worry that the horizon color selection AHJ is not a legit horizon name, so that should be removed. J does not apply to H.
As it is.
Yeah.
I didn't just make them up.
Yeah. Anything with a J is a kind of juvenile feature, is probably does not deserve to give a special color.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I don't think that we probably don't see all of these potential horizons even in the diagnostic soil profile images. So so I don't think we have to worry too much. We had Rong Wei was next.
Yeah, the first slide for the, can you show the first slide? Yeah, no, the previous one. Previous one. Yeah, oh, no.
No, this?
Yes. Yeah, the Canadian soil, that, that design look like in a cartoon. Yeah, so maybe we need to
I think that was
traditional.
I think that was just
yeah,
meant
this
as
is just for fun. I'm sorry. I wasn't saying this is what our
Yeah, also, the colors you developed. Yeah, if we want to use color, I think we try our best to, as close as or as match the natural color of the different horizon. For example, on your third slide or first slide, I forgot which. Yeah, this one. A horizon, A horizon, like AE, just like Dan said, we should have a little lighter color AE, but still have a little darker and lighter. So resemble the real natural horizon as possible. Yeah, thank you.
So what I'm hearing is we have two differing schools of thought. We have one that says use colors that are going to accentuate the differences between the horizons because it's more of a diagrammatic thing. Then the second school of thought is let's remain close to the true color of soil horizons. And so what I would suggest maybe, Lewis, is that as we go forward, maybe we do a run of kind of both, an example of both for in the future, using colors that are not necessarily aligned with the real colors of soil horizons, and then using colors that are closely associated with colors that we would see in the field. And then we can assess them side by side, and then we can have a discussion about what do we think is the better approach. And I wouldn't say, Lewis, I wouldn't say do this for everything. I'd say let's just pick maybe a couple of diagrams as examples, and we can do that, and we can kind of revisit the color scheme that maybe we think is going to work best. The last thing I'd want to do is redo all of the images for the entire book in both ways and then decide. So maybe we'll just pick a few key ones, and then we can circulate those and start from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I think that, yeah, good idea.
Louis
That
Pierre.
is a good idea.
Good. Oh, maybe Dan wants to go first. My point will be short though. For the soil schema with the different deep and the different profile, it would be important to keep in mind that we need a format that will be easy to change in the future and at any point. If in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years after we are no longer here, having something that will be easy to remake, because right now it's all made by hand, and changing everything, that's going to be tough. So looking in the future to have a format that will be easy to modify, that would be advisable.
Lewis, is that something, I don't know anything about graphical design. Is that something like the pretty standardized file types that can be used to create all these things that can make them easily editable in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I use PowerPoint a lot, so I feel like that should be pretty usable in the future. But yeah, as far as this sort of diagram, I'm not sure if there's a super easy way to make it that modifiable in the future. Maybe within Photoshop there's something we can do, but without that set of skills, I think it's hard to really modify these super easily. Unless we really simplified the diagram, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Dan Pennick.
Well, thank you, Dan. I just want to say, I from a teaching perspective, I never loved the diagrammatic horizon patterns, like like these ones. And I never liked them because students tend to look at them and think, okay, which one is this soil? And there's such a simplification of what we see in the field that it can actually almost inhibit learning, because students think, well, this has to be a BT. And for example, these would never show a BC horizon, which is very common in the field, right? In my part of the world anyways. So students don't think that BC horizons exist because they're not in these diagrammatic horizon patterns. So I've never loved them in any sense, but maybe others do. However, I think what I do want to argue for is either in the volume we produce or in some kind of companion volume is to draw upon photos of real soil profiles to show the variability that we find, say, in the orthic gray luvisols. So rather than having one diagrammatic horizon pattern, we would show 6 or 8 examples of orthic gray luvisols from across Canada to give students a sense that there's a lot of variability in soils we see in the field. So if we want to use these, fine, but I've never loved them. But I think a companion sense or using photos of the range we see in the field would be really important for this volume as a teaching tool, not as the definitive guidebook. We may want to have a separate volume for that, but nonetheless, I think somewhere that should be for the ease of students using in the field, for people learning it in the field. And I think the other difference is photos used to be really tough to include in documents like this. So we have, I don't know, 10 photos in this document. Now they're much easier to do to include them. So I would certainly encourage that. The other thing we might think about including in one document or the other, there's lots of great maps now of the distribution of orders and great groups in Canada. And it would be wonderful to include those either in this document or in that companion document we're talking about, or I'm talking about anyways. That's it.
That's good. Thanks, Dan. Richard.
I would subscribe to everything Dan Panock just said. And even as a tool to somehow utilize in the field that these particular diagrams that we're looking at right now, I scratch my head sometimes to interpret what it would really mean. The photographs I think is great. Dan, you've done an awful lot of work in gathering, compiling a huge collection of those, and I think it's a wonderful resource that can simply be tapped into as part of this exercise. I think it's a great idea too. If we can go back to the other image there of that tree fall, please. Yeah, I think if we're going to be continuing to go with some of these images, are these actually logically correct? I mean, I've seen tree falls in the field, and usually at the base of where the tree is ripped out, there's a hole. And I mean, why would it suddenly be mounded up behind where the tree has fallen out of? So maybe I've just been too narrow in my exposure to tree falls, but it doesn't look like a situation that I would typically encounter. So I think if we're going to be working some of these, maybe we should be sure that they actually logically make sense.
I would support that too, Richard.
And I think, like, so I asked Lewis to just kind of take the existing diagrams and spruce them up a little bit for us so that we could see maybe what some things that we could do. But by no means am I subscribing us to reusing the diagrams that are in the book. If we think that the diagrams that are in there are now irrelevant and we have better things to show or should show, I think we're also open to those discussions. And so I would suggest that people are going through the book and they say, like Dan's suggestion was really great, like, well, we should have a map of the distribution of soil orders across the country, at least in this book, to show, where in the country you would expect to see these things that we're going to now talk about. I think that's a great idea, and that's something that's missing in this document. And there's probably some other ideas about diagrams that should show up now. Yeah, why they decided to show, I mean, that's figure 3, and that is the pedon of an orthic humoferic podzol turbic phase in hummocky terrain due to blowdown of trees. So it's a very specific example of a control section in a very specific type of soil with a very specific type of phase. It's just to illustrate, I guess, how you would determine what a control section is. And they have an example of that in a Glade verdict black Turnizem as well. And then what's this one here? An orthic turbic cryosol in non-sorted circles. And so, I mean, we could reimagine some of these diagrams with other examples. They don't have to stay the way that they are. But Richard, I think what you're seeing here is actually the hole that's under the tree is where the tree came from, and it's been moved. So that's how I. Chi, do you have another comment?
I kind of had some quite a bit of experience there teaching classification in Lakeland College there, and I do see the need, like Dan said, there are more pictures of the profiles, and probably the picture of the profile should be put right in where that order is. We had a lot of pictures about landscape and paramaterial and all of those are in the end of the current book. Since, in fact, second edition, it was like that. I think migrating them to some of the relevant soil order will be really, really good. The sketch that Dan complained about, I find them still okay. When I was teaching soil classification, and what happens there is that has to be explained to students. This is the range. This is a diagram illustration to include all possibilities, rather than really what you might see as a picture in the soil. But but I totally in favor of adding more pictures of those different soils within that order rather than in the back.
But not everyone learning soils is sitting in a classroom.
No, and
Yeah.
it's dangerous to learn soil just in the classroom. You know, we have to be in the field.
I like that. It's dangerous to learn soil in the classroom. It might attract more
That
students.
comment
It's a
came
soil
from a
science program.
graduate student here.
Okay, that one.
Mhm.
There you go. Well, so I'm just looking right now at the book, and yeah, so we have figures 4 through 27. So there's 24 photos of soil profiles, and yeah, they're on pages 27 to 32. They come right after the soil key, or sorry, not the soil key, but the what is this called? And the outline of the system. So it just outlines all the orders, great groups, and subgroups. So it comes before the keys. But I agree. I think that now with the ease of integrating images into documents today, that these should probably all be placed within the chapters of the orders where they belong. So thanks, Graham. Integration of the diagrams was done in the soils textbook recently is an excellent example. And so, yes. And so, yeah, okay. So then, are there any other ideas or thoughts about updates? I certainly, you know, I would hope that everyone's in favor of potentially updating, you know, the pictures of the what we would call the modes of deposition or parent material, so colluvial, aeolian, those kind of things at the end of the document, and some of the landscape photos that are there as well. I suppose what we can do is put out a general call for some of these things for people that want to contribute their images. The textbook will be open source or open access, and so we will have to work like we did with the textbook with all of the owners of the images that we want to include to ensure that that they sign over the copyright. We don't sign over copyright, but they allow people to use their materials freely for non-commercial purposes.
Yeah, I think I saw some really nice image about the HE horizons when I was working in Vermilion. They could help, and I have some micromorphological pictures for some of the features of chernodynamic and glycolic. You know, if not of LFH horizon stuff, and I have also some of the polar connection previously. So
so does it make sense then for us to send out a call to get some images? I guess the question I have is what are the categories of photos that we're looking for? And so we'd be looking to potentially submission tracking down. Yes. Right. Thanks, Graham. That would be easier if people just submitted their photos with the permission as well. But so what I was thinking was soliciting the membership for diagrams, for images or pictures, photos of landscapes, photos that depict parent materials or mode of deposition, that we could maybe update some of those, and then photos of soil profiles that we would want to either have people provide already annotated or at least provide the information so that they can be annotated with their horizons. So other than that, if there's any ideas of other things, I see Dan Pennick's hand went back up.
I was gonna say, Dan, I mean, there are already hundreds of photos in that archive that's available to anyone who wants to get it. It needs to move to a better place, but there would be a rationale to have anything submitted added to that, such that we can pick the best of the, you know, there must be, I don't know, 60 orthic gray Lubisol slides in there already. So we'd be picking the best representatives for this volume, whatever the volume is. So perhaps rather than having two locations for them, submitting them to me and I would add them to the existing archive would simplify that process. Or else we could just put that archive somewhere else, more publicly available, which would be great. And then people could add them in more automatically. But I don't think having 2 locations for them would be a great idea. It just, it makes sense to add them to the existing archive, and then to think about where that archive should be parked in the long term, rather than my Google Drive. So.
Sure, and I like Graham's comment there. Yeah, maybe a request for specific profiles or landscape types. So maybe one of our first steps maybe is, Dan, do you have an inventory of everything that's included, or do we need someone to go through and kind of do an inventory of what subgroups or great groups or orders are represented, and what are the number of photos before we start asking people for more? Because I guess the last thing you want is, if you already have 60 photos of orthic gray luvisols, the last thing you want is another 60 photos of orthic gray luvisols coming in.
Well, it's not a bad thing to get 60 more, right? I mean, that gives us a tremendous sense of the variability. So I think that would be a good thing to have 60 more come in, to be honest. But there are there is an index which identifies everything that's known about the profile, including the classification. And this is whatever information was written on the slides when I manually scan them. But actually, people like Darwin Anderson, I don't know if Darwin's here, Darwin has the finest, clearest, smallest printing I've ever seen from a human being. So with Darwin, they're almost a paragraph information on some of the slides, but anyways, more power to him. But anyways, there is an index. It lists every slide that's in the collection and the order, subgroup, great group, and for all those. So that would be a starting point for what ones are currently in that archive. I don't want people to think I'm an obsessive. This was my COVID project, right? You got to do something during COVID. I'd scan 10 or 15 slides a day, but it's not as if I sit here and obsessively scan slides. I have more of a life than that. I just want that to be clear.
All right, do we have any more comments? So I guess I will challenge people to think about what potential diagrams they would like to see that are not currently in the CSSC, and then we can continue maybe to work on this idea of integrating more soil profile photos into the book. But I certainly think that yes, maybe a secondary document that kind of accompanies the main document might be a good idea. So we can work on that as well. So I'm not hearing overwhelming support for the diagrammatic representation of soil profiles that starts every one of our soil order chapters. And so is that something that most people feel should just be dropped? I see Dan laughing. Nobody wants to say what they actually think.
Perhaps a photograph of the modal soil as you open each chapter, or the central concept.
I wonder why they kept it in the last iteration too. I wonder if it's the same sort of thing. Like when you print it out, you're not getting the quality that you do when you see the photograph or you see it in real life, right? So maybe there could be like a simplification of the diagrams. Maybe we only show a few. Maybe we just show the variation.
I quite like Graham's idea, because a photograph, it's clear that it's not universal. It's clear that not every orthic gray luvisol looks this way. Whereas those diagrams kind of purport to be a universal soil somehow, right? And it's what I don't like about them particularly. Yeah, so even if this just said examples of solonetzic profiles, the one that's just gone up here, I'd be okay with that. But it's when it's taken as the example of a black solonet soil, right? Well, no, there are many other horizons that could occur that aren't shown here. So I quite like Graham's idea of having a modal profile, perhaps modal profiles for the great groups. That could be selected by a group of us that says, hey, this is to my mind the most modal orthic black Chernozem that's ever existed. But a photograph is individual. It doesn't purport to be universal. And I guess that's what I would like to get away from with these diagrammatic profiles.
One that's on the screen currently is actually, believe it or not, from the 1974 version
Yeah, it's great.
This is the precursor to the ones that Lewis just showed. So these had far more detail
They
than the
did.
newer, than the quote unquote newer ones.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd throw that in there.
But the detail, Jim, is given as generic detail, whereas the newer diagrams tend to give the misconception that soils are a straight line evolutionary sequence or something.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, I actually think these ones are far preferable, actually.
Yeah, and I'd just like to point out from these diagrams that these prairie soils have LH horizons, and so Jim Miller wouldn't have had to write that paper if he would have just gone back to the 74 diagrams.
Prairie soils do have LH horizons. Come on. Just we have to be careful how we do things.
Chi, do you have another comment?
I wonder if we, for each of the soil order there, to also provide a few landscape type of pictures, because I think Dan knows this really well. Not the landscape features affect soil development, and people, when they see a few landscape like that, it helps them to build a bit of understanding. But again, every picture tend to kind of affect people to see, well, this is what you would see exactly in the field. People kind of get to that kind of image reinforcement, and sometimes it is good, sometimes it's not preferable. And I definitely agree with Graham. We only use a kind of orthic for mineral, and for organic, we only use a typic type of thing, and not going beyond the great group level there. So you don't get overly bogged down with details.
Thanks, Chi. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up on the chat. Richard, you have your hand up.
Yeah, in addition to the soil profile diagrams we've been talking about at the end of the book right now, we've also got, as she was alluding to, photographs of landscapes and a few other diagrams stuck back there. How are we going to handle that? Or are we going to sort of go to the same strategy Dan Pennock did you in terms of having a collection of landscapes photos that might be just as in the same way we could draw upon to improve upon what we've got in the back of the book right now? Is that important? Do we continue with that? If so, how do we move forward with it?
Yeah, I think so, Richard. I think that part of this is also trying to get some more modern photos of those landscapes and landforms potentially. I've also heard rumblings that we need to maybe work on redoing that entire section of their book in the future, because we don't align with many other systems of landform classification, which we probably should try to have some alignment with. And so I think there's a lot of things there, but I think at a minimum, it would be nice to get some higher resolution, new photos of those landforms that we're using.
I'm not sure there's a pole long enough for me to touch that with.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Constantine and then Graham.
Okay, yeah. As for photos or diagrams of landscapes and parent materials, they should be, I would afraid putting them with orders. I would rather stick them with the definitions in the same chapter as where we have definitions of landforms and parent materials. And also I would encourage putting the diagram of hammocky, undulating, and so on from, is it manual for mapping? So bringing that diagram in the classification to illustrate what it means. So definitions of undulating and such. We also not define landforms, we define surface expressions and give examples of landforms. So those two should not be, they are not equal. It's not the same. So illustrations should be for surface expressions, not individual landforms. And let's say if Chernozyms are illustrated by undulating, well, the whole British Columbia is forgotten now with Chernozyms on slopes of mountains, right? So like which one you would illustrate as the best? I don't think attaching landforms or surface expressions to orders would be appropriate. Thank you.
Yeah. I seem to recall a publication that came out of British Columbia a few years ago, Soil Landscapes of British Columbia, which linked the soil and the landscape entity together very well. I did have a copy of it. I don't know if I still do, but I thought recall it as being very well done. And also thinking of some of the relatively recent FAO publications on soils in the biological side of the game. There's been some very, very good integrations of imagery and descriptions in those, and they are using good photographs of specific soils as they do their descriptive stuff. And that's what I was thinking of more when you said the building on Dan's suggestions of having good imagery associated with the individual orders. How to place them, hey, that's another discussion. Given the fact that it's going to be electronically driven publication, perhaps, it does give the freedom to rethink the entire layout of the classification manual. The current classification manual, what I call the Orange Book, has developed through 3 or 4 different iterations. But the tools available to a working group like this now are a huge improvement on what was there years ago. But it requires, I think, a really good graphics artist, communication type person, perhaps, to integrate it, which means it becomes a different sort of project to what we're thinking about at the moment. There's kind of a scientific side of it as well as a presentation, science communication side of it.
Thanks, Graham. Paul?
Okay, thank you. And sorry for having to join the meeting late today. It sounds like you've had a great discussion. Since Graham mentioned the soil landscapes of BC, just in case this isn't familiar to other people, this was a publication that was produced for 1978 to coincide with the holding of the Soils Congress in Edmonton that year, and to accompany field trips that were going in through BC. It's sort of still in print. I'll send a PDF of it along, or a link to Dan, and he can add it to the library of things that he's been compiling for us. One thing I want to put a plug in for, which was used in Soil Landscapes of BC, which I haven't seen emulated too many other places, and that was using oblique black and white air photos, so something pretty old-fashioned, and then they were annotated showing the distribution of different types of soils across landscapes. Now, it works really well in BC because you've got big elevation gradients to play around with, but maybe have a look at that, at those graphics in that publication, and it might give you some inspirations for things that could be done either within the forthcoming classification or in whatever sort of supplementary things go along with it. So I'll send that link along to Dan.
Thanks, Paul. I also remember some nice, they were just photos of landscapes that were done for the CLI, the original CLI 1965, the grayscale images, but they delineated CLI ratings across a landscape, so you could kind of see how these different areas of the landscape were meant to be rated based on the original interpretation of CLI. And I thought that those were really well done as well. And that was, that was back in 1965. And so Are there any other comments with regards to images, photos? I don't see any, so we will move on, but we will revisit this. And I expect all of you to contribute to this part of the book. I was going to mention there's two other items that we'll touch on very quickly. First is that we have received back finally from Canadian Science Publishing a draft agreement for copyright of the Canadian System of Soil Classification. And so I've been a little bit delinquent. I have to send an email back to them with a couple of questions about the content of that agreement. Nothing major, pretty simple stuff. Just want to check a couple of things. The draft agreement went to council and council seems to be okay with it. And so it looks like after we get some answers to a couple of questions, we can finalize that agreement. And so that document will be ours pretty soon and we'll be able to do with it what we want, which is great news. And then Richard would like to put in a plug.
Okay. And I think it's relevant for this group. The next International Soil Classification Congress will be held in Hokkaido, Japan in June of next year. I can just quickly show the program here. So it'll start on Monday, June 3rd and run through the 4th. The 5th, these will involve the various technical sessions. And then the excursion begins on June 6th and runs until June 8th, wrapping up on June 9th. At this moment, they're suggesting that the charge is going to be between $1,200 and $1,500 per person to participate on this event. So the last one was held in Mexico, I think in 2022, but it was supposed to be 2020. And before that, I think it was in Europe in 2016. This is held every 4 years, this event. Maybe depending where we are in our stage of our redevelopment of our classification, there might be desire for someone to go and provide interaction. I think isn't there some kind of monies within the Canadian Society for these types, supporting these types of participation in pedology?
Yeah, we have a previous recipient of that funding on the call with us today, Dr. Kamal. Yeah, so there's funds available through the Canadian Society of Soil Science to send somebody to a pedology related meeting annually. I'm not sure how often it gets subscribed to be honest with you, how many times it's actually been awarded, but it is there and it's awarded annually. And so yeah, I would encourage if somebody wants to go to Japan in 2024 that they put their name forward and submit a request for funding and go represent us on the world stage. Perfect. All right. Any other comments today? I think so. The next meeting, I don't even remember. Oh, the next meeting, I believe we're going to do a revisit, updates from the Anthroposol working group who have been working diligently. And then also an update from the group looking at redoxymorphic features and how we deal with them poorly in the Canadian system of soil classification. And then the meeting after that is the June meeting, and we're going to kind of do a wrap up of the things that we've talked about. And we're also going to revisit, or I'm going to bring forward some of the smaller change ideas that have been brought or put into the online form. And so I'll put in a plug again. If you do have some small ticket items that you want to see, things that annoy you in the book that you want to see updated, that form is the place to go and do it and point that out. So we've got quite a few submissions, and so we'll go through some of those smaller changes, but some of those smaller changes might end up being bigger discussions because, like as we said earlier, like one of those is looking at, should we go back to using subgroup modifiers instead of defining all of these subgroups, and see the proliferation of our taxonomic system. And I can tell you that, with the Anthroposol group, they're struggling with some of these things as well in terms of, depending on where they propose to put the Anthroposol within the taxonomic system, it can lead to proliferation of subgroups, and using these modifiers can reduce the impact on the number of subgroups that we see in the system, but it doesn't, increasing the number of subgroups or not wanting to increase the number of subgroups is probably not the right rationale for saying, no, we don't want to go that way. I think we have to think a little bit more critically about the pros and cons of either approach, not just in terms of the number of subgroups. So with that, we have a comment from Chi before we go.
Yeah, I just felt the anthropogenic soil there. It is good to have it there, but potentially might have the biggest disruption of the system in the way of whatever we have currently focusing on natural soils. One option there may be dividing this CSSC soil classification into two categories. One is the natural soil, another is probably the technical classification for things like the anthropogenic soils. Then you could avoid a lot of issues.
Great. Yeah, I mean, we'll spend an hour, I think, looking at this at the next meeting, and so I have a feeling it's going to be an interesting discussion. All right, thanks everyone. We'll send out a recap and a link to the video, and we will touch base again in a month. Thanks everyone.